an international audience. Welcome to everyone. It's a particular pleasure to have this opportunity to introduce Professor M.A. Quayum. We go back a long way. Quayum was at Dhaka University. In fact, he was one of my students there.
Yes.
And then subsequently, he then went on to do his research, and then he came to teach at Dhaka University. We were colleagues for a while. Then he moved on to Chittagong, I think, and from there to Singapore, then Kuala Lumpur, and now he's in Australia. So even when he was in Singapore or Malaysia, we were in touch. And I remember the arts festival in Singapore, organized by the Arts Council of Singapore, where Quayum was instrumental in getting me over to participate, because it's an international event, and I think until then there was no one from Bangladesh who had taken part. And it's beautifully organized arts festival with poets, writers from all over the world, and lots of events in different venues in Singapore. And then subsequently we again met in Kuala Lumpur, where he spent many years as a professor, and again he was instrumental in bringing people together. I mean, through his journal, The Asiatic. I think he played a big role in really putting Asiatic on the map of the world. It is now a well-known journal. It's very, very dynamic also, and liberal in its policies, hospitable to a variety of contributions. And now I believe he is retired from KL, from his university, and joined his family in Australia. So they're all Aussies now, I think. And the first time we met in Singapore, his daughter was a charming little girl who played with me, all the time I was there, and had a delightful sense of humor, which I'm sure is still there. And now she's a grown-up young lady, a professional. It's so satisfying. It makes one so happy to see the children grow up into mature and responsible adults. In Australia, he is associated with two universities, with Flinders as honorary professor, and with the University of South Australia, I think, as an adjunct professor. He has been researching and publishing copiously all his life. The subject of his talk today is Tagore, and I think he shares this quality with Tagore, this being prolific. He has published 34 books, 120, something like that, 120 encyclopedia entries. He has been a visiting professor in America and other places, and he's on the editorial board of a number of distinguished journals. At ULAB, we've been trying to get him to visit us. Unfortunately, because of various problems, he could not make it. This was a year or so back. And then the pandemic, more than a couple of years back, and then the pandemic struck. But even this shall pass, as the saying goes, and I'm sure it will not be long before Quayum visits ULAB and spends some time with us. I mean, it's up to him. We are open to, any suggestion that he might have about the role he could play. Come and teach for a term, perhaps, or come on a shorter visit, conduct workshops, give talks, and our students would find that, and our colleagues would find that very rewarding. I'm glad to see a large and distinguished audience here, and we're all eager to listen to him on a subject that is, I think, very dear to every Bangladeshi. Rabindranath Tagore, and the focus will be on the ideological aspects of Tagore, how he, his career shows the evolution of a particular kind of cosmopolitanism, and then education and educational theory is something, again, in which he had a big contribution to make. So this, the title, as you know, is from Rabindranath Tagore, From Nationalism to Cosmopolitanism, and I think he's going to link that to Tagore as an educator. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Quayum, and I'm sure all of us will find this very stimulating engagement. And after that, the talk, we will have a Q&A, which I'm sure will be a lively discussion. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, everyone. And I'd like to hand over the microphone to Quayum now. So, over to you.
Thank you, Professor Kaisa Haq. That was a very generous introduction, I think. Professor Kaisa Haq is my former teacher, as he mentioned, and then later he became my colleague and somebody I regard very highly. I should also thank Professor Shamshad Mortaza and the whole of ULAB for organizing this. Now, this talk is an extension of my previous talk, which I gave about a month ago, comparing Tagore to Rokeya and showing how the two autodidacts, Rabindranath and Rokeya, became pioneers of education in Bengal in India, and compared their philosophical dimensions with regard to education. Today, I'll explain how Tagore's imagination with regard to education evolved from nationalism to cosmopolitanism. But before that, I would like to explain the objectives of Tagore's education, compare his objectives to the objectives of colonial education, as well as the education in the Western world at the present moment. And then I will try to focus briefly on the problems that Tagore encountered in schools. Remember, he went to school for about 4 or 5 years and was in 4 schools within that short span of time. And then he dropped out altogether. And I will also explain briefly what induced him to take up the role of a nationalist. Because Tagore, as I have written in many of my articles, is essentially a cosmopolitan thinker, a world-centric thinker. But at that phase of his life, when he started his school at Shantiniketan, he was more of a nationalist. Even somebody has, Kathleen O'Connell says that he was more of a Hindu nationalist at that time. So I'll briefly visit that as well. And then I'll come to how his imagination evolved after the Swadeshi movement in 1905. But let me begin with a maxim in Bengali that you would have heard many times in childhood. Lekha pora kore je, gari ghora chore se. Now this maxim translates to what the utilitarian thinker Francis Bacon would say: knowledge is power. Now, I'm not sure whether you have thought about the maxim carefully, but if you do, you'll see that this is another way of saying that if you work hard, you'll become rich and powerful one day. Rabindranath was actually aware of this maxim, Bengali maxim, and he responded to it in his book, Creative Unity. And this is what he said in response to it. He said, it is an offer of a prospective bribe to the student, a promise of an ulterior reward, which is more important than knowledge itself. In other words, in childhood, we were asked to acquire knowledge not for its own sake or for doing good to society and humanity, but for personal material gain, for self-enrichment, self-empowerment. So that was, the idea of education centered around the idea of success, kind of a Machiavellian idea. So education was a kind of a cultural capital. The more degrees you have, the longer tail you have. Now, if a child grows up with that kind of ideology, would you be surprised if he or she grows up to be somebody like Gordon Gekko? Gordon Gekko in the movie Wall Street, 1987 movie Wall Street, where he says, greed, for lack of a good word or better word, is good. So in other words, he says, greed is good. In a sense, Gekko is right, because the modern world seems to have been taken over by market capitalism. Something that Wordsworth would say, the world of getting and spending, the world of consumerism, where greed is predominant. Education has also become a victim of this market economy. As in many countries, it is now entirely market-driven, controlled and guided by commercial considerations. It was also the same during the colonial time. Australia, where I currently live, is no different. The goal of education in Australia now is to, quote unquote, produce job-ready graduates. It encourages education in STEM subjects like science, technology, engineering, mathematics, not in humanities. So if you want to study literature or philosophy or history at a university in Australia from this year, your fees might go up by 120%, up to 120%. But if you study science, technology, engineering, and maths, it will reduce by about 60%. Now, what is the reason for that? The reason is that, as the Australian Minister for Education said, a cheaper degree in an area where there's a job is win-win for all students. So job is the main focus of education in Australia, not moral or spiritual development or self-fulfillment of the individual. Now, contrary to this materially oriented educational outlook, Rabindranath's educational vision was based on the principles of Dharma and Kalyan. Rabindranath believed that education should be holistic and wholesome. It should not only address the practical side of life, but also the moral side of life, the intellectual side of life, the spiritual side of life, so that somebody with education can become sort of a complete human being. Rabindranath believed that education should invigorate the moral and spiritual side of the individual, cultivate their feelings, their sense of empathy, sympathy, and a spirit of self-sacrifice. And they should also know through education people should be able to locate themselves in the context of nature and the whole of existence. Mind you, Rabindranath actually inherited the Upanishadic idea of Advaita, that God contains everything. We dwell in one God. So we should know where we are in the context of existence. That was important for him. So in his book, Personality, this is what he said. He said, we may become powerful by knowledge, but we attain fullness by sympathy. The highest education is that which does not merely give us information, but makes our life in harmony with all existence. Now, Rabindranath went to China twice. In one of his lectures in 1924, Rabindranath said that the function of education should be to create harmony in society, to create unity in society. Unity not in uniformity, but unity in harmony, where the different cultures will have their traditions, but at the same time, they'll come to respect one another through a sense of fellowship. So there will be no racial prejudice, no national prejudice. So when did the next question would be, when did Tagore got involved in his educational enterprise? Now, Rabindranath Tagore, Rabindranath's son, in his memoir, On the Ages of Time, says that Rabindranath got involved in education after the Shilaita phase. So he was in Shilaita from 1890 to 1901. So he got bored there. Then he came back to Calcutta and moved to Shantiniketan to embark on a new project. And he says, Rabindranath says in the memoir, On the Ages of Time, that Rabindranath was never satisfied with a single purpose in life. And he always looked for fresh fields to give scope to his active and creative mind. So that search for the fresh field is what led him to Shantiniketan and to his educational projects. And his biographers have also emphasized this multidimensional aspect of Rabindranath's imagination. I think Krishna Dutt and Andrew Robinson have emphasized that in their book, Myriad-Minded Man. And Shishir Kumar Ghosh has also emphasized that when he says that Rabindranath was Nana Rabindranath, many Rabindranaths folded into one. But I would like to suggest that Rabindranath actually started reflecting on educational issues long before he came to Shantiniketan. And we see evidence of that in many of his writings. For example, he started thematizing on colonial education and the devastating effects of colonial education on children in his short stories, Chuti, and another short story, Ginni, and in his poem, Tuipaki, and his celebrated essay, Shikkha Herfer, which were all written in 1891-92, so 10 years before he came to Shantiniketan. I would like to suggest even further that Rabindranath actually began his pedagogical journey from the moment he dropped out of the Indian school system. Now, mind you, he was a genius. And when he left the school system at the age of 13, he must have started thinking about why he could not cope with the educational system there. And he actually hints to that in one of his writings. He says, I'm quoting from Rabindranath here, the founding of my school had its origin in the memory of that longing for freedom, the memory of which seems to go back beyond the skyline of my birth. So the quest for freedom, which he was deprived of in colonial school, is what led him to search for a new educational system which will provide the freedom that the Indian children needed. Mind you, he was a poet first. Rabindranath said that I'm a poet first and a poet last. And he also said that Shantiniketan was a poet's school. And on another occasion, he said, Shantiniketan was a school, was a poem, not in the medium of words. So now let me briefly explain what are the problems he encountered in colonial school. Now, as I mentioned earlier, he went to 4 different schools within the span of 4 or 5 years, which he actually articulates. The problem, the foremost problem that he encountered there was the lack of freedom, which he articulates in his poem Duipaki very nicely, and also in his short story Tota Kahini, or the parrot's training, where he uses the metaphor of the caged bird to show how the school system was depriving the children of their freedom. And Rabindranath, like Sri Aurobindo, actually believed that human soul is like a seed. It's like a seed that grows and fructifies best in an open, free environment. But these colonial schools were anything but open and free. They were more like panopticons. Panopticons, a type of institutional building and a system of control designed by the English philosopher and social theorist Jeremy Bentham, and also highlighted by Michel Foucault in his book, Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison. So Rabindranath describes the schools that he attended in childhood in his essay, Shikha Samusha, where he describes the schools as, these are his words, my translation of his words, barracks. So it's like more like military barracks or police barracks, lunatic asylums, hospitals or jails. He also describes them as joyless prisons and zoo gardens. The second problem that he encountered in the colonial schools was the lack of emotion and sensitivity of the teachers. The teachers were tyrannical, he says. They're ruthless. They're rude with the students. And I think if I have time, long time, I would like to explain some of the short stories where he illustrates how the teachers would behave with the students. In Guinea, there's a wonderful example there where the teacher humiliates a young boy in front of the whole class without realizing that he's destroying the future of the boy. It will take away his confidence forever, all right? And so these teachers were ruthless, and they also lacked any appreciation for the warm and tender feelings of the children, or the potential for their intuition and imagination. And for Rabindranath, like Einstein, imagination was very important, right? Like Einstein said, imagination is more important than knowledge. Tagore actually believed in that kind of thinking. The imagination is more important. Wisdom is more important. And he also believed that the teachers were very ill-trained. And I'm quoting now from Rabindranath. He said, the teachers knew neither good English nor good Bengali. And the only work they can do is misteaching. And he uses the metaphor of the lamp. He said that if a lamp doesn't have a flame of its own, how can that lamp light another lamp? So if the teachers are not enlightened, how can they produce enlightened citizens or members of society? And Rabindranath also believed that the greatest teachers of men are the greatest lovers of men. So that is a quotation from him. So you have to be a lover of children or for all your students to become a good teacher. But obviously these teachers had no respect or love for the children. And then the fourth problem that he highlights is the practice of cramming or memorizing or rote learning. And that happened, Rabindranath says, because the medium of instruction was English and the students were not really familiar with the language enough to understand what's going on. So the easiest way for them was to memorize things. And that actually throttled their creativity and love for knowledge. Now, the colonial education system not only was detrimental to the children, Indian children, but it was also detrimental to the growth of the nation, according to Rabindranath. Why? First and foremost, he says, it destroyed the local educational system. In his essay, Shikha Vidhi, he says that this colonial educational models were so powerful, so strong, that they gradually swallowed, consumed all the local educational systems or models. And that eventually actually was in a way of reinforcing the colonial hegemony on India. Why? Because obviously if you're educated in an alien language, a language that you are not fully familiar with, then obviously you will lose your sense of culture and identity and your spiritual roots and culture and so on and so forth. And this will produce more of what is called Macaulay's children, a Bhadralok group, an elite class of people in India who are Indian in blood and color, but English in taste and opinions and morals and intellect. And they would start a new kind of hegemony on the local Indians, this middle class elites, educated in the English medium schools. So that would create a new kind of rift in society. Rabindranath actually has an excellent satirical portrayal of these Anglophile Bengalis, or he had a word for it, he called them Ingobangas. These Ingobangas, those who are into mimicry, how they'll end up. He portrays that in his short story, how the fox in this book shape. But I'll not go into the details of that, where a fox tries to become a manush, a human being. And he sacrifices everything. He learns how to walk like a human being. He learns how to dress like a human being. Eventually, he gets rid of his tail. And then when the fox community comes to look for him, and when they discover that he doesn't, behave like the fox community, then they desert him, right? They reject him. And that actually haunts him for the rest of his life. So this is what is going to happen to the Bengalis or Indians who are into mimicry of Indian culture, for English culture. Rabindranath also believes that without a local educational model, Indians will never be able to address the unique problems that are there in Indian society. Unique problems arising from the caste system, problems arising from poverty, from our religious differences. And I quote from his writing here. He said, "In my view, the imposing tower of misery, which today rests in the heart of India, has its sole foundation in the absence of education. Caste divisions, religious conflicts, aversion to work, precarious economic conditions, all center on this single factor." So with this, he felt induced to come up with a local example of education. He got into his educational mission to show how India should have its own educational model. Because without our own model of education, we'll remain colonized by the British forever. And in his essay, The Way to Get It Done, he says, I repeat, our education is a thing which we should first of all take into our own hands. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Kathleen O'Connell, who I came to know through Professor Kaisa Haq, and now she has become a close friend of mine. She has a book on Tagore's educational philosophy. And in that book, she says that at this phase of his life, when he came to Shantiniketan, Rabindranath was informed by 19th century Hindu nationalism and revivalism. But I would like to suggest that Rabindranath actually was critical of Hindu revivalism, even at that stage. Because he wrote his short story Khatha, the exercise book, which came out in 1891. And in that short story, he launches a scathing attack on Hindu revivalism and their superstitions. Because Rabindranath was, although he was a Hindu, he subscribed to the Brahmo Samaj sect. And therefore he believed in what he called the inner Hinduism, or the spiritual aspect of Hinduism as laid out in the Vedic scriptures and the Upanishads. So although he shows a great deal of enthusiasm in Hindu spiritual ideas, he was never into orthodoxy. He was never into rituals. And mind you, Brahma Samaj was founded by his grandfather, which was known at that stage as Brahma Sabha. And later, his father actually was instrumental in creating the movement. Now, one thing interesting is that his nationalist stance at this stage put him at odds with somebody he admired most, Ram Mohan Roy. Now, Rabindranath describes Ram Mohan Roy as the father of Indian Renaissance. He also describes him as the prophet of Indian nationalism. We know that Ram Mohan Roy established 3 institutions in Kolkata in the early part of the 18th century. 1817 Hindu College, then the second one in 1923, I think, and a third institution also he set up in Calcutta. And the medium of instruction in all these institutions was English. And so he was actually advocating English before Macaulay's Minutes and the English Education Act of 1835. He was vehemently opposed to Sanskrit education. And he believes that Sanskrit education will only interfere with the progress of India, modernization of India. Indian literature would not prepare the youths of Bengal, he said, for the demands of a modern life. And when the Bengal government wanted to introduce a Sanskrit college in 1823, Ram Mohan Roy actually wrote a letter of protest to the Governor General of India at that time. And he said that introducing a Sanskrit college was best calculated, I'm quoting from his letter here, best calculated to keep his country in darkness. Now, in that debate that was going on in India about the direction of Indian education system, so Ram Mohan Roy took the side of English education and Western curriculum. Rabindranath took the side of Sanskrit education and Bengali education. And the first school that he set up is called Brahmacharya Ashram. And English was taught in that school, but it was just a subject. Now, I should emphasize that Rabindranath was never opposed to English culture as such, or to Western civilization. He believed that Indians had a lot to learn from the West. But of course, he was opposed to their imperial designs. Now, as I mentioned, the school was called Brahmacharya Ashram. You can even tell from the name that it was religious in spirit. Brahmachari means somebody who is into celibacy. It's one of the 4 stages of a Hindu's life. Brahmachari also means the desire to attain Brahmahood or divine state. And ashram means a spiritual shelter. So in other words, it translates to house of divine quest. And Rabindranath acknowledges that he was inspired to set up the school by Vedic literature. And he says that he created the school on a Vedic model, the model of the Tapovan that was practiced in India in the medieval ages. And he says, I'm quoting here from him, the voice came to me in the Vedic tongue from the ashrams, the forest sanctuaries of the past. So he began the school, Rabindranath actually began the school with only 5 students. And Rabindranath was one of the 5 students. But what is interesting is that he had 5 teachers as well. Unlike Rokeya, where Rokeya set up the school in 1910, but she was the only teacher there. But interestingly, although it was a model on a Vedic school of Tapovan, Rabindranath actually shows that he was always multi-religious in a sense, because of the 5 teachers, 3 of them were Catholics. But at the same time, notice the paradox here. I think Rabindranath's imagination is always given to a lot of paradoxes. The 5 students, Rabindranath was like 12 years old at that time. They were sort of required to wear yellow robes as befitting brahmacharis. And Rabindranath had to learn Sanskrit before he entered the school. All this are actually laid out in his memoir, On the Edges of Time. And Rabindranath also practiced certain religious codes at the school. So the students would have to recite Upanishadic verses. They were forced into meditation. Now, Rabindranath was practical enough to understand that children don't understand what meditation means. But he would get them to go and sit under different trees and spend about 15 minutes there every morning, so that they come to understand that, you know, life, collective living is good, but sometimes you also have to leave away from society to find time for reflection. He also introduced the practice of pranam. So, you know, in our culture, we have this practice of pranam where you touch the feet of somebody you respect. But what is astounding to me, you know, somebody who admires Rabindranath a great deal, is that he actually condoned the caste system at the school. So if the teacher was not a Brahmin, as I mentioned, 3 of the 5 teachers were not Hindus. So if the teacher was not a Brahmin, but if the student was a Brahmin, the student didn't have to touch the feet of the Catholic teacher. And because the brahmacharis were celibates and they had to live a simple life, so Rabindranath actually deprived them of all kinds of luxuries of life. So there was no furniture at the school, no toothpaste was allowed, no shoes were allowed, no hair was allowed, and classes would be under the trees most of the time. And of course, the reason the classes were held under the trees was because Rabindranath also loved nature. We see that in many of his writings, including the short story Bolai. And this is what he wrote to the Maharaja of Tripura in 1902. I'm quoting from his letter to the Maharaja. He says, I wish to keep my students away from all the luxuries of European life and any blind infatuation with Europe, and thus lead them in the ways of the sacred and unsullied Indian tradition of poverty. So he actually glorified poverty at that stage, right? But in spite of all this, he actually followed a regular curriculum at the school. He would be teaching maths and science and English and so on and so forth. And in the evening, there would be no classes. Why? Because birds sleep at night or in the evening. So in the evening, there will be no educational activities, only cultural activities, songs, dramas, drawings, and so on and so forth. This is the poet Tagore talking. He also introduced many kind of extracurricular activities like social work, gardening, and so on and so forth. So Tagore's school was anything but a colonial school, just the opposite of it. He said the colonial schools were more like factories that produced factory workers or clerks, the babu class of people. His school was more like a place that produced enlightened citizens. The colonial schools used English as the medium. His school was more like Bengali used as the medium. Memorization was emphasized there, but here, free or joyful pursuit of knowledge. There, a lot of confinement, here, a lot of freedom. So much of freedom that as I mentioned, the classes would be held under the tree. And if there was a bird calling, the whole class would stop to appreciate the music. Now, so this was Rabindranath in 1901, 2, 3. I think the transition came in 1907. As you know, Rabindranath was seriously involved in the Bongo Bongo movement. And he wrote so many songs, including our national anthem at that time. So many that Ezra Pound actually said that Tagore has sung Bengali to a nation, the American poet Ezra Pound. But 1907, something happened. As you remember, Khudiram Bose, he wanted to kill an English judge. So he threw a grenade on a carriage that actually killed 2 British women. Rabindranath said, enough is enough, because he was never into violence. So he left the movement, and he never went back to the idea of nationalism again. And from there on, Rabindranath started showing the interest of building a common human heritage, where the cultures could share one another's knowledge. And he said that although he's a Bengali, his love for literature should not stop with Bengali literature. And this is what he said, I quote from him, "Have I not born to the world? Have I not been born to the world? Are not the creations of every philosopher, every poet, every scientist as much for me as anybody else? Should that realization not make me proud of my place in the world?" So this is the moment of transition. In other words, he was becoming a cosmopolitan thinker at this point. His imagination was becoming world-centric. He was embracing all other cultures as part of the world. So this is where he brings home and the world together. Now, the kind of cosmopolitanism that he believed in is what is advocated by critics like Anthony Appiah or Nussbaum, or one of his contemporary relatives, I think, Rabindranath Tagore, who teaches in Singapore. So they advocate a kind of cosmopolitanism where you embrace the local, but you also extend yourself to the global. So you are, in a sense, a locally rooted cosmopolitan. You are committed to a universal humanism, but avowed for love for the country. So you show local attachment, but also global engagement. And this is when he started setting up the university, Vishwabharati. Mind you, the foundation was laid in 1916, but the classes began in 1923. And this is what he wrote to his son Rabindranath in 1916. The age of narrow chauvinism is coming to an end. For the sake of the future, the first steps towards the great meeting of world humanity will be taken on these very fields of Bolpur. Now, Bolpur is a district where Shantiniketan is located. And he also described his university as international university or world university. And as you know, Vishwabharati means India where world where India, it means where India meets the world. And in his essay, An Eastern University, Tagore wrote that Vishwabharati was meant to create a great federation of men, a unity wider in range and deeper in sentiment, stronger in power than ever. So, he became so cosmopolitan at this time that he introduced Islamic studies. Mind you, there was a lot of prejudice at that time against the Muslims, because the Swadeshi movement was creating a lot of rift between Hindus and Muslims at that time, and there would be a lot of riots. And yet he introduced a chair for Islamic studies at Vishwabharati in 1927. And he introduced a chair for Persian studies in 1932. He introduced a Chinese studies department in 1937, and also a China Bhavan at the university in 1937. So the model of education that he was trying to advocate at that university in what Nussbaum calls cosmopolitan education. And he also described the university as a world center for the study of humanity, a place where all cultures come to meet. Now, and he invited many international scholars, as you would know, so that real exchange can take place. And Indira Gandhi, who was a student there, she once said that really Vishwabharati was not a university as such. It was more of a way of life. And Amartya Sen says that the classes would be held in such a way so that one would begin with, say, discussion in Indian culture and gradually move to Western culture or to the culture of Japan and other places. So it was really inclusive in approach. And Rabindranath always believed in the true union of East and West. So he set up a third institution the next year in 1922, which is called Sriniketan. It's an institute for rural reconstruction. So whereas the vision for Vishwabharati was grand, the vision for Sriniketan was rather small. It was intended to make the farmers more self-reliant and self-respectful, because he saw that the middle class was abandoning the rural areas and they were moving to the city. So he wanted to also upgrade the farming practices of the villagers with this third institution. So he was really, at this point, he was embracing both the home, looking after the villagers, but he was also a man of the world. So let me conclude by quoting from Ralph Waldo Emerson, because I always think that, the vision that Tagore had about the scholars at his school was very similar to the vision that Emerson had in his essay, The American Scholar. Now, in his essay, Circles, Ralph Waldo Emerson says, the life of man is a self-evolving circle, which from a ring very small rushes on all sides outwards to new and larger circles, and that without end. The extent to which this generation of circles, where will without will go, depends on the force or truth of the individual soul. The circle of Rabindranath's life continued to expand at a very rapid pace, moving outward with a vast force, breaking boundaries, until it grew into a circle whose center was everywhere and its circumference was nowhere. I think I'll conclude with that. I would like to invite questions now, Professor Shaksha.
Thank you so much, sir. The things that you talked about, like we all read Rabindranath Tagore on different occasions, but this is one area we don't always address. We kind of tend to enjoy and read his poetry, work, short stories, engage in translations, but we don't necessarily to look at the educational aspects that Rabindranath Tagore engaged in. And as I see the chat box, I mean, there has been quite a few comments, observations, questions from our students and guests alike. So at this point, I would like to, maybe it would be better if we address the questions. Sir, would you like them to ask you directly, or should I read from the chat box, or?
I think either way is okay. I think they can ask me if they want to.
Okay.
Or you can read out.
Okay, I think I can probably read out. I don't know if they have problems with the speaker or anything. Okay. So Mohammad Mashur Rahman, he is a student of ULAB. He says that as a student who will hopefully be graduating in 2 semesters, I'm feeling the urgency to get a job. It's not that I need the job only to support me and my family, but I also feel that I need to work and earn money in order to maintain the harmony of my existence for my spiritual development as well. I think I take the idea of working and getting a job as antagonistic to the idea of being educated. It would not make any sense for me. What's your take on it, sir?
Okay, I think, Rabindranath was a very practical man as well. All right. So he lived 10 years in Shillita to look after the family estates there. So obviously he was not just an idealist, he was also a practical man. So he was quite interested in the practical side of life, in the sense that education should also bring a good living. But not only that. So success was not the only concern for Rabindranath. That's what I'm trying to emphasize. That it should really address your physical state, your moral state, your spiritual state, so that you can become a holistic person. All right. So getting a job, Rabindranath was not so idealistic that, individual getting education should not get a job. Job is important, but you should not stop there. We should go beyond that.
Yes. So second question is from Asif Kamal. I think he's basically addressing a situation that many of us have pondered on. Like, what mechanism, if any, should there be of making enlightened teachers? Or is it just automatic? If there is no government or a scholastic scheme of making enlightened teachers, how can this tradition prevail? All our senior enlightened teachers are getting retired without leaving equal, except a few legacy of enlightened teachers prepared to lead. Circle is getting smaller day by day. In most cases in Bangladesh, once a teacher steps in teaching without any prior preparation, she has to struggle for a long duration of career to settle herself as an enlightened teacher. What is the solution? What do you think about this?
I don't think I have any magic answer for that. I think there are a lot of enlightened people in Bangladesh, actually, maybe we don't hear their voices. Maybe the larger voices is that of the politicians and others. But I have a feeling that often we get wrong people in the education profession. Why? Because if you come into education, you really must love students and must love knowledge. It's not a 9 to 5 kind of job. It's a 24-hour job where you take your job to your bed as well at night. So that when you're going to sleep, you're also thinking as to what you might be doing tomorrow, or what you have done today and how it could have been better, and so on and so forth. So if you're not passionate about teaching, maybe teaching is not the right thing for you. And that will have to be decided by the individual. So I would not come into teaching if I really did not love my students. That is very, very important for me. And Rabindranath also believed in that. Enlightenment, I think, can be acquired. If you are given the right opportunities, you can read a lot, and maybe you can create a kind of an insight. But the passion has to be there. Without the passion, there's nothing to build on. So I think we should try to get the right people into teaching. And Bangladesh has a lot of enlightened people. People who are publishing a lot, and they're well known, well regarded outside Bangladesh. Many people have left, actually, which is sad. Left the country, not because they don't love the country, but I think, as when I left Bangladesh, I was advised by my teacher, Professor Sirajul Islam Chaudhary, that I should go not because Singapore is a better place, but because I will have better opportunities for my research. And he saw me as a researcher. Okay, so I think, I would like to think that the world belongs to me, and I can be anywhere as long as I'm doing the best I can.
Thank you, sir. So I would like to open the floor. I mean, those are the questions I saw on the chat box, so I thought they could be addressed first. But please, respected guests, any questions from anybody, that would be great.
I have a question, if Sohana,
yes, please.
Thank you so very much, Professor Quayum, for your beautiful presentation on Rabindranath's take. I'm just curious to learn from you that whether we can identify Rabindranath Tagore as a post-colonialist, even though I understand that post-colonialist, the idea itself is pretty vast and very diverse. The kind of things you discussed about Rabindranath actually have some sort of similarities I can find with the idea like Gandhi, the way he was understanding, independence, and he was, constraining his idea of not allowing the other cultures, other industry or industrial movement into his country when the greater India was emerged in the scene. So yeah, to make it short, what's your reflection on that? Thank you.
I mean, obviously he was post-colonial in the sense that he was writing back to the imperial, masters. If you read his short stories, his novels, there's a lot of criticism of the way they were running the country and so on and so forth. But he had a lot of differences with Gandhi. I must emphasize that. All right. He had a lot of respect for Gandhi, and they had a lot of mutual respect. But Gandhi actually was more into Swadeshi and Swaraj, and he was into burning of clothes. Rabindranath said that's not the way to go. We must really try to find education as a solution for India. Because Rabindranath believes that, when Indians are oppressing other Indians, like the higher caste people oppressing the lower caste people, or men oppressing women, untouchables being deprived of all the opportunities of life, political independence is not going to take us very far. So he was more into the social aspect of life, into the cultural aspect of life, into the spiritual side of life. But nonetheless, he also addressed a lot of political issues. And when a racial riot broke out in Chittagong and Noakhali in 1931, he actually urged Gandhi to say more about the Hindu-Muslim relationship, because he believed that addressing Hindu-Muslim relationship is very, very important. You know that he, in his novel Kore Baile, he addresses that a lot, as to how to bring about the multiple communities of India together. Unity was more important for him than mere independence. So although we can see him as a post-colonial thinker and writer, but we can also put him in many other boxes, if you like.
Thank you, sir. I just have one more quick question, if
please
you allow. And this is a question not pretty much ontological, but more as epistemological. The way we understand that we must find an alternative or the third way to, both engaging with the modernity as well as finding our own voice, and so that we can, hybridize these two things. If I to quote a little bit about Homi Bhabha and the other, subaltern writers. So my epistemological complexity is that within the dominance of this modernity and all these Western ideas about how education is supposed to be, how we are doing in terms of, raising our own voices. Is it getting any space within this dominance? The way we want the third ways to, go up, are we getting enough chances? And if yes, then how much we are successful? If no, then what could be done? And that's why I just tend to say more about epistemological, not the ontological, because we get the ontological part that we need to do it. But how and how much we have done so far. Thank you.
Well, I think there's no easy answer for this, because the Western voice is very dominant at the present time, and the world is centering around material success and so on and so forth. And I think we have to, I see a future, because India is coming up as a civilizational force.
Hello.
Hopefully there'll be more voices from our part of the world, those who will be able to make a mark on the world stage. But that's a long way to go, and there's no really quick solution to any of these problems. Yeah.
Any other questions? Shamshad sir or Kaiser sir?
Sorry, Kaiser sir got logged out, so he's joining back. But do you have any other question? Like, maybe we take 2 or 3 questions. I can see Professor Amin Rahman, if he has any comment.
Yeah, I have just a minute. I have a small comment. You mentioned about Einstein and Tagore. We know that he did meet Einstein, I think, more than once, and they must have talked about different topics. And I wonder if they talked about education and what were their views, and did they agree or disagree, and whatever. Since you are doing research on this, you'll be able to say better than me. I just want to know. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for asking that question. They met twice, and they had discussions on various issues, and both the interviews are actually available online. So if you search online for Rabindranath and Einstein, both the interviews are there. And I think they mostly discussed on, not so much on education. I think they've discussed more on God, on liberty, on freedom, and things like that. Education was not really a subject matter in the discussion, as far as I can remember.
Sir, you need to turn on your microphone, sir.
Doing that. Now that one, yes, I have read the transcript from the, internet, you can read it, but how authentic? I mean, that time there was no recording. So how and who did the recording, and is it genuine, authentic? That's my question, my next question.
I think
Quayum sir, you need to turn on your mic. It was turned off.
Can you hear me now?
yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So what I was saying is that I'm not sure whether the interviews that we see online is authentic or not, but it has been verified by other people. And the impression I have is that it is quite authentic. And the ideas that we come across in the interviews match with what I think Rabindranath would be thinking on God and creation and human relationships and so on and so forth. So yeah, and he was very well known in the West. He had exchanged many thinkers, Western thinkers. Even Montessori came to visit his school. And she wrote a letter to Rabindranath after Rabindranath died, where he celebrated Rabindranath's contribution to education. So I would like to think that because Rabindranath is so well known, I don't think something on him, especially with his relationship with his, regarding his relationship with Einstein would be there online. That is not true. Any other question?
So I'm just intrigued by the fact that, so his early schooling in the UK and how it impacted. So you did mention that, so how it actually changed his view about education altogether. So his exposure to the British education system. So, if you could elaborate on that. And the other interesting thing that you mentioned was the inner Hinduism, so the inner spirituality of Hinduism, and he was not an Orthodox Hindu because of his, Brahmo association. So we all know that, but at the same time, he searched for the ancient India in the Malacca Straits and in Indonesia, Singapore, and Malay region. Do you think that there is an aspect of colonization in his search for ancient India in places outside of India?
Okay, thank you. Rabindranath actually was sent to England for study at the age of 17. I think he went to study law. And I think he lived with the family there. And that actually introduced him to the Western culture more intimately. And he has a lot of good things to say about that interaction with the family. But he could not finish his degree, and he came back after 1 or 2 years. And that's when his father got upset with him. And he was punished by the father and sent to Shilida for that. Because he thought that the son was not really all that practical. And he had to really cope better with the practical world. So he was sent to Shilida so that he could pick up the more realistic side of life. So he became a zamindar at Shilida for 10 years. So his stay in what I actually spoke on mostly is his experience in the colonial schools in India. But I did not touch on his exposure to British education system in the UK. But again, he could not cope there. I think he found the structure to be almost similar in many, many ways. So he was not very enthusiastic, and he doesn't write a lot about his experience in the UK, except for his relationship with the family where he lived. And as for his visits to Malaysia and Singapore, to Indonesia, I think he came to Malaysia and Singapore twice, and he lived about 3 months in Indonesia. And actually he imported the batik culture from there to Shantiniketan. He came to see how the ancient Indian culture has influenced the Southeast Asian cultures. So I'm not sure whether he was into colonial enterprise or not. But obviously he was very curious to find out how the Hindu culture and Indian culture has come all the way to, especially to Bali. He lived there for about 3 months and did a lot of writings on the interaction between Indian culture and Southeast Asian cultures during that period. So I think he had a great deal of admiration for many of the Asian cultures. He, as you know, he went to China twice. He went to Japan multiple times. So he wanted to bring all the cultures home so that Indians could learn from these cultures, and there'll be real, constructive engagement between multiple cultures within the Asian societies. So he believed that, if Asia could come together with mutual respect and with a sense of fellowship, then I think we would be in a stronger position to stand up against the West. But he was never really, as I said, paradoxically enough, he was never really anti-West. He had a great deal of respect for the West. And he said that, I remember in one place he said that one of the differences between Indians and the British or the Westerners is that when the Indians come outside India, they start opening shops. So we have the shop, opening shops. So we have a very small kind of imagination. But when the Westerners come to another country, they come to conquer. So he saw something good in that they have a broader outlook of, imposing their culture on other cultures, but we are more timid as a people, according to Rabindranath. So I think what is fascinating is that, when you read Rabindranath, and he wrote so widely, and there are so many contradictions in his writings, because I think as he was writing, he was also developing, and he never actually worried about the contradictions. More like Whitman, I think, I think Whitman, towards the end of his poem, Song of Myself, Whitman says, do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I think Rabindranath also believed in that kind of spirit. So what I'm today, I may be different tomorrow and think differently tomorrow. So he was not too worried about the contradictions that are there in his writings. And that makes
Sir,
it
I totally agree.
More authentic. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, Shamshad.
No, sorry. You're absolutely right that, so, his writing is in a flux and it keeps on changing. And, you have, in a way, surveyed those changes, like his focus on nationalism to cosmopolitanism.
Yes.
And he also thought of like two different Europes, two different West. Now, actually valued both. And for him, there has to be a combination of science and religion. And towards the later, career, like, so his look east policy. So he had a great respect for China and Japan, and especially in Japan, like, the way they have harnessed technology, but not forgetting their heritage. That's the, later day model for him, so if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think he loved Japan, but he also scolded them for the imperial design.
He did.
Yes, and he also admired the Chinese a lot. I think, in 1937, when this conflict between China and Japan started, he took the side of China against Japan. That's why the Chinese have a lot of admiration for Rabindranath. Do you know that there are many streets in Singapore named after Rabindranath? I think there are at least 3 streets in Singapore named after Rabindranath.
Oh, I didn't know that, sir.
Yes.
Okay.
He's very
Wow.
well respected.
Okay. That's interesting. Right.
He's very well respected there. I think in Beijing, there is a whole section of a street named after Rabindranath.
Wow. Okay. And they have a bust of Tagore, like, at
Bust of
Shakespeare's.
Tagore, yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, at Stratford upon Avon. Maybe Kaiser sir can have a concluding remark, and before we wrap up. Kaiser sir is back. Kaiser sir, yeah,
I'm back.
You accidentally.
Thank you very much. Well, Quayum, thank you for making the time to appear before us virtually and talk about your engagement with Tagore and his cosmopolitanism. I'm sure from the response of the audience, it's clear that they've enjoyed your talk very much. And I hope that there'll be more in future. But if I may give my personal response, I'm very skeptical about claims about great figures. And if I look closely at even Tagore, there are all kinds of problems that arise. I mean, the binaries on which his thought is based, they sort of melt on examination. I mean, think about this thing about colonial education and traditional Indian education. Well, I mean, the tolls were as ruthless as the colonial schools. So were the maktabs and madrasas. If you look at even the ashrams, even in the Mahabharata, there are stories of, wonderful stories about the way the gurus would discipline their pupils, And there's one story in particular where the 3 pupils are given some tasks, really horrendous tasks. And the one who endures a lot of suffering and still, he's the one who is the perfect sort of disciple. And you see the concept of knowledge and wisdom in traditional Indian culture, where, it's something that you get from the guru. It's a mantra that is given to you. You see, the guru hangs on to his mantra. It's not something, there's no transparency. It's not open, really. Then regarding the question of language, all kinds of things about colonial education. The picture we get here contrasts with that we get from the Caribbean. I mean, if you think of Derek Walcott, yes, Naipaul, they're full of praise for the schooling that they received in Trinidad and St. Lucia. You see. But I think the main problem that you are addressing is the conflict between the human desire for freedom and the problems that arise because of the disciplinary mechanism that society and civilization try to impose on us. So it's a question of, again, it's back to civilization and its discontents, which we find in every age. From the moment we became civilized, this problem has been there, and it has evolved, and in each phase of history we find it in a different form. So, but I think what we can take from Tagore is this glorious vision of harmony, and each society, each age has to make, try on its own to translate this vision into practical reality, how to sort of accommodate the spiritual vision into a society which has also, as you said, I mean, he was a very practical man. You have to sort of acknowledge the demands of the market, the demands of society, the demands of professional life. Tagore has become something of a cult figure, which is to me an embarrassing thing. But I think critically looking at his writings is it's something very important. And I'm glad that you have devoted a lot of your time and energy to the examination of different aspects of Tagore's works. I hope we will have more seminars of this sort, and you are always welcome to visit us virtually and also in the flesh when circumstances permit. Thank you again, and thank you, warm thanks to the audience. Now, if Shamshad would like to round off with.
So if Sir, there are two questions. If Sir doesn't mind addressing them, unless we are in a hurry, so.
No.
Yeah. So one is from Dr. Mamoon from Shah Jalal University. So he says Tagore's concept of Samaj Desh were different from the way we think of. Is it possible to think of education the way he did without these concepts?
Dr. Martuja, I am actually.
Right. Sorry. I got it wrong. So I'm sorry. So Dr. Mamoon, do you like to read out your own question?
No, you can read out, but just I'm from Rashtriya University, not from Shah Jalal University.
Yeah, so sorry about that. So yes, Dr. Mamoon's question is about Tagore's concept of Samajam Desh and how different it is, the way we perceive it today. And there's another question about how can we harmonize contemporary educational philosophy, as you mentioned about Australian education and STEM, with the spiritual quest of Tagore. I think that's Mushir, one of our ULAB student. Over to you, sir.
Okay, thank you. So I think Rabindranath actually renounced the idea of nationalism, as you would know. He rejected the aggressive nationalism of the West because he believed that Western nationalism is a source of colonization. So they actually came to our societies to prosper their own nation. And he saw that Gandhi's nationalist movement was creating a lot of riots in India because it was marginalizing the Muslims and creating a lot of religious nationalism among the Hindus. So he rejected nationalism in that sense, but he was a very patriotic man, as you know. He loves the country. And he saw this idea of Samaj, the ancient idea of where the villagers live together in mutual harmony with respect, as the way to build the civilization. But I think that was really impractical. I don't think we can really pursue that path. in the present time. But his education can be detached from his idea of, Samaj, and yet can be pursued to a certain extent, because I believe that, yes, we cannot detach education from the modern materialistic aspirations of the people and society. But at the same time, I think, education should also address the goodness that is in us. It should try to make us better human beings. It should not really cut off the noble aspects of the human personality. So that is important, so that education brings you to a material success, but also makes you a better human being. How to make sacrifices. Rabindranath is very contemporary in a sense, because if you look at our present civilization, what is the problem in America now? If you really detach education from the noble aspect of life, you can produce leaders like Donald Trump, ruthless people who care for their material success only and nothing else. So that kind of vanity can come when you are not really sensitive to the good qualities that human beings are capable of. So I think, so I'm not trying to say that, we have to follow entirely what Rabindranath is saying, but I subscribe to the idea that it's important to realize that the nobility that he was trying to emphasize in the human individual is important. We should not really absorb ourselves entirely into the material world. That is not going to make the world a better place. The better place will be when we, approach with a sense of awareness of mutual respect. And I think the oppression that is going on in many societies where minorities are being victimized by the majorities, like in America, the Black Lives Movement, right? Black Lives Matters movement. I think I think if you look at Rabindranath's educational philosophy, I think that can address that issue to a certain extent, because he believed in unity and mutual respect of human beings and sacrifice. So what he would do actually is that he would take the children to walk through the nearby villages, and the villages were, the surrounding villages were populated by the minorities and Muslims, Shantals, and they would be exposed to that kind of culture. And that would actually build the imagination of inclusivity. So, no writer, no human being is complete in that sense. I think there are limitations with all writers. And we should not really, put them on a pedestal. They're not demigods. They're human beings with certain ideas. So I view Rabindranath in that sense, that he had certain good ideas. But of course, as I said, he is full of contradictions and paradoxes, and there are limitations. After all, he was a human being, and we are all shaped by our experience. We have to realize that. So because he had bad experience in the colonial school, so he went against it. But Ram Mohan Roy was all in favor of English education. So I think his experience actually shaped his imagination, and therefore his criticism has to be taken in the context of his own experience. That is important, I think.
Thank you so much, sir. So I think, so there are no more questions, and I think we have spent quite some time on discussion and question answer session. So at this point, I would like to ask Professor Shamshad Murtaza, our Pro VC and the head of the Department of English, to say a few words, the concluding remarks. Sir.
Thank you, Sohana. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, sir, for this wonderful presentation. And, so within the span of 40 minutes, you covered the entire pedagogical philosophy, as well as the mission that Tagore was going through. So starting from Shantiniketan to Vishwabharati to Sriniketan, and also the nationalism and the pan-Asian cosmopolitanism that he envisioned. So he covered all the bases, and it's amazing the clarity of that, so the conceptual clarity that was really showing in your deliberation. Even like, somebody who has not come across Tagore on a serious way, or like, the scholarly engagement, if it was missing, I'm sure like, from today's lecture, it will be clear to them. So I really thank you for this, erudite presentation. And at the same time, I would like to thank you for taking your time out on a Saturday. It's never easy on a weekend. So thank you. And also for the audience. So during this pandemic, so Saturday morning is not the right time to be for a webinar. So for those of you who have showed up, I'm really thankful for your participation and thought-provoking questions as well. So making this question and answer session really interesting and exciting. So I'd like to thank the event management team, especially Dr. Mahmood Hassan Khan, so who was in communication with Professor Quayum from the beginning, and then Dr. Farzana Hafsa, so she took over, and Dr. Sohana for emceeing today's program, and the event management team, like of the Department of English, and of course the IT, without his support, it would be difficult to have today's program. So as Kaisa sir was saying that too often, we treat Rabindranath as a cult figure, but we need more scholarly engagement, to get the best out of him. And Quayum sir also said that, there's no point in putting someone on a pedestal. We need to have this kind of scholarly engagement, So, and Rabindranath is not a name that should be simply remembered on Baisha Sraban or, Pochishu Boishak, things like that, So, and I like the way Professor Quayum ended up with Emerson, just to make sure that we do kind of benchmarking, not simply glorifying someone for the sake of glorification. So the romantic tradition, the aspect of nature, the microcredit. So he did not miss anything. So again, thank you so much, sir, for the wonderful presentation. And we look forward to welcome you to ULAB. So we almost were ready to welcome you last year, but then the pandemic happened. I'm sure that, once things go back to normal, we are going to have you in person. And our colleagues and our students will be extremely benefited by your presence. So with that, I would like to wrap up. So thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Can I thank a few people as well, please?
Please, sir.
Yes, I would like to thank you, of course, Professor Shamshad Murtaza, for organizing this. And, you have done a great deal for me in the meantime, in many, many ways. I would also like to thank, of course, Professor Kaisa Haq, who is like a brother to me, and I respect him a great deal. He was my teacher, of course. When he came to the English department as a new lecturer, I was in the 4th year, I think first year of masters. So, so that's why it was easier for me to call him Kaisa Bhai rather than Kaisa Sah. And I was sharing a room when I was teaching at the University of Dhaka. I was sharing a room with Shaukat Bhai, and Kaisa Bhai was very close to Shaukat Bhai, and he would be visiting our room quite frequently. So I'm grateful to him in many, many ways. And I also love and admire his poetry. So I actually have written a bit, not much. I spent most of my life writing on Malaysian Singapore literature because I lived there. So I came to appreciate their writings. I'm quite new to Rabindranath, quite new to Bengali literature. I started actually translating Rabindranath when I realized that my daughter has lost the language. So I started translating for her, and then it became a book, and eventually 2 books of translations. Emerson, well, I did my PhD on American literature. I actually love Ralph Waldo Emerson and Walt Whitman, and Saul Bellow, of course, and Henry David Thoreau, and I actually spent 4 years of my life on their writings. And then in 2011, I moved to Bengali literature. In the meantime, I was mostly focused on Malaysian Singapore literature. And I would love to come to Bangladesh, actually, because I'm writing a book on Rokeya at the moment. So I would like to go to Kolkata and Bangladesh to do more research on these writers. I would also like to thank my former student, Sohana. It's nice to see you after a long time.
Thank you, sir.
And also I would like to thank my another former student, Mahmud Hassan Khan. He was my student in Malaysia. And Said Farzana, who sent me an email yesterday about the talk today. So I'm grateful to all these people for organizing this. Thank you very much. And I enjoyed it thoroughly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hope to see you again soon.
Absolutely, sir. We'll be in touch. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
And see you again before long.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Kaiserwai. Thanks very much. Bye.
Thank you, sir.
So hopefully we'll get the vaccine before us, right?
We are getting in March.
Okay, great.
And congratulations to you, Shamshan.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, and I look forward to your book project, sir. So
yes.
I'm working on the chapter, and this is really helpful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'll get back to you on this.
Sure.
You take care. All the
you
best.
too, sir. All the best. Okay, bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Cheers.